Okay.
Oh, sure. Sure, I'll take care of that. Because I did see it come out.
All the way down here.
Yeah, I have it as having come out. All right, I will check with them. You're welcome. Okay, great, thanks. Bye-bye.
Good morning.
How are you?
Fine, how are you?
Good. Shut this off now.
How are you today?
Doing well, doing well. It's like everybody's here with sweaters and jackets. It's
So good to wear wool.
Well, you should wear a talit then. You know, you can wear wool anytime when you're wearing a talit.
Yes. You only wear it on a Saturday morning, it's
No. You wear a talit every day.
every day.
Every day.
But not on,
But not at night.
and not on Friday night.
Not at night. That's right. That's right.
Vayera. Vayera.
Hello, hello. Hi.
Hey there.
Hello.
Hello. Yeah. Everybody looks so
Yeah.
So wintry.
wintry.
You know, the temperature went down to 50, so.
It's so good to turn off the air conditioner.
I assume it was wonderful.
It was nice, it really was. It was just
Rabbi, after class, would you have a minute?
Of course.
I can show you the yard side class.
stuff in the house.
Yep.
My husband is so upset
No
about
big
it.
thing.
We'll talk about it right after class.
Wedding like dinner dance, but we wouldn't expect that.
Well, that's good. People should be
Yes.
able to have
Yeah,
the
it was
day.
wonderful, and it was very
Missed you, Malcolm.
Well, we were away and then I got sick.
And then you had company.
And then we had our Israeli company come in. But I'm well and we're back and everything is fine and the company is good. How's keeping me?
We had a little trip, we went to St. Petersburg.
Oh, good.
How are you doing?
It was really nice. Right before all the bad weather began.
Happy to be sitting down?
Good time.
I've got a ways to go before I even consider that, so.
Yeah, but she never lost power, so she was happy. I assume she's back at work today. She was off today. She was back.
We're getting an update from the, Kathy, are we getting an update from the storm-tossed north?
Yeah. Do you have,
Our kids are without power.
Still?
No, Virginia's okay. Massachusetts is back on now.
Right.
The New York ones are still without. They're
That's-
like a mile away from each other.
Wow.
And they won't have it till the end of the week or later.
Phew.
Because there are 50,000, like Lisa explained it, it's a quick fix.
Right.
But they're doing all the hard stuff first. She said
Right.
it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to her.
Well, I'm assuming that the people who do this, you know, year in, year out, have some form of policy for some reason,
I
but,
think they're triaging it.
right.
yeah, they
Which
think they go
areas?
to the, into whose power, I mean, you're bringing
Neely.
on, you
Yeah.
know,
Neely.
hospitals and all that stuff have to be.
My grandson that lives down at NYU.
Can you imagine getting that?
That's exactly how
Where
it's
we
water
could go?
Because that's where it was all cut off.
That's
They had hardly any
So
rain.
what he did was
Hardly any rain.
Okay.
They must have been in a cell, but there was no rain.
It looks terrible, and I think.
But it doesn't hurt or anything.
You know, I told Neil, our ancestors down here in Florida knew what they were doing. They had homes on the ocean,
Right.
but they were called beach shacks. And shack was the operative word.
Right.
The wind could blow them over and you just prop them up.
Put the walls back up again.
That's it. They were shacks. That's what people had on the water. Not homes, shacks.
All right, I think we have a very good showing. It's nice to see that people are coming out now that the weather has gotten cooler. No one's staying at home hiding because it's too cold to go outside. So one of the perks of being in Florida is that you never have an excuse of not coming because it got too cold. So we, of course, send our prayers and our best wishes to those who are dealing with real weather up the coast, up in from New Jersey and Delaware, and we have friends, of course, in Maryland still, and all the way up to the coast that have been suffering thanks to this storm that has hit the coast. You may have noticed that there are many people hoping to make religious mileage out of the storm. I don't know if anyone has heard any of these ideas. No?
Oh, about the reasons for the.
Exactly. It's God's will, but if God's will interpreted with our own agenda.
Yes.
So, for example, there are those that say this was God's will for New York authorizing gay marriage, and therefore the entire Eastern Seaboard is being smashed. There are on the other side of the agenda, just to make sure you understand that from the perspective of many of these people, that God is belongs to every political party. There are others who say this is God's will as retribution for our environmental sins. And therefore God is showing us that he will continue to punish us for our environmental sins.
And New Orleans was an evil city.
Right.
So
And with Katrina there were just as many. Absolutely.
Sodom and Gomorrah.
Which leads us to this week's parasha. Because after all, what
That's
is...
your agenda.
Well, that's my agenda, yes. I never claimed not to have an agenda.
He didn't pay me to say that.
But the foundation for the idea that God would use a disaster to show his displeasure with humanity's actions is rooted not just in the flood of Noah, which is sort of a global occurrence, but more precisely with the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is described in this week's parasha. The parasha of Vayera, exactly. So what is often overlooked in the discussion of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the seemingly obvious explanation of why they were being destroyed, which actually is not very obvious, is the fact that throughout the parasha we are treated to the ambiguity of God's revelation of God's will and plans. That is to say, Sodom and Gomorrah is not the only occurrence in this parasha where God predicts that something is going to happen and then makes it happen. So we're going to look at a couple different scenarios throughout this parasha and see how well we can figure out what's actually going on and why. Does that make sense? Maybe? Okay, hopefully it's easier to interpret Torah than it is to interpret God's will from meteorological phenomena. Let's go ahead and begin on page 99, which is the 18th chapter of the book of Bereshit, the book of Genesis. And we're going to begin at verse 1. Who would like to read a little bit for us? Thank you.
The Lord appeared to him by the
Terabim.
cherubim.
Isn't that one of those great English words that's actually just as confusing as the Hebrew?
It's a terebinth anyway.
What's a terebinth? A terebinth was considered to be well, it could be just an oak tree, which is the idea here, but it often was considered a sacred grove of trees.
Terebinths of Mamre.
Right? And who's the he pronoun here? The Lord appeared to him. So who's the him? Abraham, exactly. Which, if we didn't have the Haftarah for Lech Lecha on our right-hand side, we would know that from chapter 17, if we were reading this straight through. So it's clear in context. Keep going.
He was sitting at the entrance of the tent as the day grew hot. Looking up, he saw 3 men standing near him. As soon as he saw them, he ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them, and bowing to the ground, he said, "My lords, if it pleases you, do not go on past your servant. Let a little water be brought, bathe your feet, and recline under the tree. And let me fetch a morsel of bread, that you may refresh yourselves. Then go on, seeing that you have come to your servant's way." They replied, "Do as you have said."
All right. Who's they?
The visitor was considered them the angels, messengers from God.
Have we heard the word angel yet?
No.
No? What are they?
Men.
They're men. All right, so this is going to be part of our issue here. Because we have Abraham. That we know. And Abraham is being visited. That we know. Who is visiting Abraham? That is going to be a little bit more complicated. That we can't say yet, that we know. But who are some of the potentials for visiting Abraham? Who can we identify this as? Well, who does the text identify it with at this point?
Divine being.
3 men.
They
What's
said
that?
3 men.
At this point, we have the word anashim, we have the word men. So, this could be, if we read nothing further and no commentary at all, this could be 3 guys showing up at Abraham's tent. Right? That's one possible way to read this. Some of you appear to have already been familiar with some of the commentaries and insights from other sources. Who do these 3 men become identified as, according to those other commentaries? Messengers, melachim, and more specifically than just a generic messenger from Western Union, we're talking about angels.
The very first sentence said that God appears in it.
And the man who honestly is not a shill points out very rightly that much as the riddle poem of "I Was on My Way to St. Ives" points out, that first line is actually kind of important. And what we have here is that God is also visiting Abraham. Right? We'll see how that works. Okay. In some way, we are going to have to deduce from the text and from the implications of this visit what is actually going on. Because as we're going to see, there are difficulties with thinking that the visitation comes from any one of these groups. Okay, we'll uncover those difficulties as we go. Okay, at the moment though, those are our 3 options. We may explore a few more as we go, but those are our 3 to start. All right, carry on, Mary.
Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Quick, 3 seahs of choice flour."
Seah is the usual.
Seah.
Right.
Of choice flour, knead and make cakes. Then Abraham ran to the herd, took a calf, tender and choice, and gave it to a servant boy, who hastened to prepare it. He took curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared, and set these before them, and he waited on them under the tree as they ate.
Okay. Very wonderful example of a hachnasat orchim, of the mitzvah of hospitality to others. In this case, possibly complete strangers, possibly much more than that, but at the very least setting a model that one should be welcoming to those that come within one's tent, or even around one's tent, that you bring them in. Make sense? Okay. Any clues that help us identify the 3? Question first, or a comment?
Yes, a question, yes. It was custom in that time for a man like Abraham kneel in front of the visitors, or it was the possibility that he identified. That was
Okay. So here's a question that is referring to a clue. If we want to try and understand who it is that's appearing to Abraham, perhaps Abraham's behavior will give us some clues. And so the first thing that caught your attention was the fact that Abraham is bowing down in front of them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he is bowing down in a posture that becomes synonymous with worship in later Jewish writing. That we might then say that, who was it? that maybe this is God,
Mhm.
right? But what would be a problem with that interpretation?
Three.
We've got plural here. We've got three guys. So if it's God, and that explains the bowing, then we have a problem because God isn't three. God is God. So we would then have to try and find a way to understand the appearance of three rather than one. Now, of course, you can probably already guess that the Christian scholars say no problem at all. But Jewish scholars don't have that particular solution at hand.
Yes, can I ask a tangential question? We know that there was no Torah yet, but Abraham was supposed to have lived by the Torah anyway.
According to rabbinic thinking, Abraham, all of the Avot, all of the patriarchs kept Torah, yes.
So why is he serving milk and meat?
Ah,
I mean, he served the milk first.
and that's the classic interpretation, is that indeed Abraham is seen as preparing a meal which includes both meat and milk, but if you look very carefully, he provides the milk first and then the meat, which halakhically is perfectly permitted.
And they had
takes
to prepare
hours.
the meat.
It takes hours to prepare this food. Making the bread,
Exactly.
letting it rise, put it
Exactly.
together, put
Good
it in the
answer.
oven.
So,
And this,
Well, if you want to be very precise, it doesn't actually take hours to make the bread. There is in fact a midrash that says that this was taking place during Pesach, and so in fact they were making matzah. On top of that, we also have the fact that the bread never makes it to the plate. If you notice, he says to Sarah, "Make the bread," but the bread never appears in the list of what he puts in front of the guests. And the Midrash says that's because at this moment when Sarah was making the bread, she suddenly became Nida again. That her menstruation cycle began. After having gone through menopause years ago, all of a sudden she begins to menstruate again, and therefore the bread becomes tameh, it becomes ritually impure, and she doesn't want to serve something that's ritually impure to the guests, which may or may not be holy beings.
Where do you see that in the word?
That's why I prefaced it by the phrase, the Midrash says. But I can explain to you where the Midrash gets that from. And the Midrash gets it, first of all, from the fact that Abraham tells Sarah, make bread. And yet, when Abraham is putting things in front of the guests, it doesn't include bread.
And they had to come up with it.
So we have to explain, why didn't Sarah do what Abraham asked? And rather than simply saying, the author chose to leave out the detail of bread with the table setting because he'd already mentioned it during the preparations, they decide to say, no, this is linked to the prophecy that is about to be uttered, that Sarah is going to give birth to a child. And so then they say, well, and what would convince Sarah of the trueness of such a prophecy? Well, if she suddenly began to menstruate, that's the kind of thing that might tip her off that something unusual is about to happen. So,
That's for sure.
absolutely.
She could have just burned it.
Or she could have burned the bread, exactly. Maybe she just
She was
burned it.
laughing so.
But, you know, the bread
Fill in the
that they
ashes.
made so often was made on a curved hot plate, and they just poured the dough on that, and it sizzled up and that.
Correct, like
Pita.
well, like pita bread and like matzah would have been traditionally
And like-
made, yes.
Like the regular Arab bread.
Correct.
I mean, it's
The flatbreads,
instant.
yes.
Yeah, the flatbread is
Right.
almost made instant.
The only thing that takes time is the actual rising of the bread, and that is contingent upon your culture. In America, we like big, fat, fluffy bread. In many other parts of the world, they're much happier with thin bread that is flatter. Not necessarily cracker like modern matzah, but more like pita.
it's better to digest.
I don't know, is it? I don't know enough about bread biology, but makes
Saturday,
sense.
they served the curds and milk while the cow was roasting and the bread was baking.
Exactly, and despite common misconception, the waiting period between meat and milk is between meat and milk, not between milk and meat. Because the actual issue is whether there is something stuck in your teeth. And when you drink milk, it doesn't get lodged between your teeth. You don't need a toothpick after you eat your yogurt. You do need a toothpick after you eat meat. And the idea of waiting was a way to ensure that anything that may have become lodged between the teeth that you were unable to get out through the normal process of scrubbing your teeth with eating a crusty piece of bread would have gone out by itself. But when you're eating milk, you don't have that same concern, and therefore, as long as it's a separate meal, that is to say, marked separately by a separate bracha, by a blessing over what you're eating and a blessing after, that you are permitted to eat milk first and then meat. And assuming that you don't actually have, a bit of cheese still wedged between your teeth.
And curds.
Okay? What's that?
And cheese and curds.
But the curds and such, this was a much softer kind of cheese than we have now. You got to think more like cottage cheese. I suppose that could get stuck. Maybe they didn't have that many teeth.
Belabor the point.
What's that?
I didn't mean to belabor.
It's a very important point because it narrows us, it focuses us down to reminding that in order to understand the story that is happening here, we have to pay attention to the details. And we can't just slough them off as saying, oh, well, it's just something there.
Well, in that case.
Well, in that case. So hold on a second.
He took the curds, the milk, and the calf that had been prepared and set them before him, all at one time.
Yes, but in that order. As courses of a meal would be the explanation of the Midrash.
Just put it all on the table at the same.
Not according to the Midrash. Now, of course, according to other interpretations, the Avot, the patriarchs, did not keep every aspect of Torah, and therefore there's no problem with them eating these things at the same time. Okay, so we have already an issue of bowing, which, if it's a sign of worship, would definitely lean us towards saying he's bowing to God. But if he is bowing to them, to the people there, then that could mean that he's simply showing it as a sign of respect. Mm-hmm. And that shouldn't surprise us. After all, Abraham was a very nice guy. So if he wants to be respectful to these visitors, why not? However, what about the eating? What does that do for our agenda of who's visiting?
Seems more like men.
Seems a lot like the kind of thing a person would do. Because do angels eat? Title for a good book, but maybe a cookbook. But no, angels don't eat according to strict interpretations.
How about angel food?
How about angel food fest? Oh. It's going to be one of those kind of days. What does that mean for devil's food? Okay, so angels don't eat, and obviously God does not eat either. So if they're eating, we've got a problem. Because that means it's got to be people that are showing up. Does that make sense?
Could they just be eating to be polite?
Or they could be eating, in fact, as the rabbis teach, that the angels, in fact, don't need to eat, but they take on the semblance of eating in order to teach us that one should follow the customs of whatever place you are in. So since the angels normally don't eat because they're, heavenly, when they're down on earth, in order to teach us a lesson about following local custom, they appear to eat, which is a wonderful interpretation, but not necessarily the exclusive interpretation. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, let's keep going. We've got miles to go before we sleep.
They said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" And he replied, "There, in the tent." Then one said, I will return to you next year, and your wife Sarah will have a son. Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. Sarah had stopped having the periods of women, and Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "Now that I am with it, am I to have enjoyment with my husband so old?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh, saying, Shall I in truth bear a child, old as I am? Is anything too wondrous for the Lord? I will return to you at the same season next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah lied, saying, "I did not laugh, for she was frightened." But he replied, "You did laugh."
Okay, turn the page. We got to figure this out. Any clues about our visitors from this section?
But suddenly it speaks of the Lord.
Yeah, we got Lord going here. And we're not just talking about Lord in the first instance, where it was the actual word Adonai. We're talking about the actual name of God, the Yud and the He and the Vav and the He. which is often translated as the Lord, but of course is God's personal proper name, as opposed to the title Lord, which was what was used earlier. We all follow that? So there's a difference between the title of the Lord, which is what Abraham uses to address the people that are arriving. If you look back here on verse 3, Vayomer Adonai, right? But there we have the word Adonai spelled out with an aleph, a daled, and a nun, and a yud. Whereas here, same translation, that's the trouble with English, of Lord, but in the section we've just read, it's referring to the holy name of God, the yud, the hey, the vav, and the hey. How we doing? So apparently, God is the one saying, Sarah's going to have a kid, and God is the one saying, is there anything too wondrous for God? Which is okay if we want to believe that it's God, but it brings up those consistency issues of, well, wait a minute, what about the multiple number of people? What about the eating that's going on? On the other hand, if we want to say it's angels speaking in the name of God, which is not a far-fetched idea, it's just not quite as straightforward, then at least we can say, well, angels, they can know what's going to happen. They can know the future because, through God's gift. On the other hand, if it's just three guys coming in from the desert, and all of a sudden they're making comments about their host's wife, who's rather old, going to have kids, is that the kind of thing we expect from just three guys that walk in out of the desert? Not normally.
Is Abraham having a face-to-face communication with God?
Well, we know that the beginning of this parasha, Vayera, is that God appears to him. And the question is, what form of appearance is it? Is it face-to-face? Well, we know from later Torah, and certainly from rabbinic commentary, that nobody except Moses ever experienced God face-to-face in the way Moses did. And so we would have the additional problem, if we were to say this is God, when Abraham is, putting food down in front of someone, to imagine that one of them or all of them is God means more of a face-to-face communication than we normally would ascribe to Abraham's experiences. All right, so who's good and confused? Everyone? Who feels we don't know who these people are? We don't. We don't. This is hard. Okay, so, like I said at the beginning, bear that in mind when people claim they know why natural disasters are happening and what God intends by it. If we can't even figure out from the clearest revelation that God gave us, namely the Torah, what's going on and what's God's doing, or even if it is God in the scene, in the literal sense, then we should be a little bit more suspect of those who claim an intimate knowledge of what God wants and is doing.
Could it be that they really are three men, but in the course of the encounter, Abraham is in some way seeing God through this, like we say now, you can't see God, but you see God in the way people are compassionate and the way they have hospitable. So here's this example of him being hospitable to these three men, and in his head, he is having this encounter with God. God's like kind of spelling it out for him. And so one man says, "Oh yeah, next year your wife will have a kid," and then that voice is back in Abraham's head.
And saying, yes, that's true.
Right, exactly.
That's not just
don't laugh at this guy.
It's not just some random nomad making weird statements about your wife, the kind of thing that normally would get you attacked for coming to someone's house and saying, oh, by the way, how's your wife? I know she's pretty old, but I make you bet she's going to have a kid next year. What? Get out of my house. No. You're saying there's a parallel mental vision that is going on at the same time as the physical reality. And that Abraham is perceiving God or God's intentions through the acts and interchange with these three people. And that it's Abraham's overlay to reality from this God vision. Right. Okay, we got that? Randy, and then we'll come back.
Obviously,
there's nothing obvious about it.
Let's say whatever.
Apparently. What's that? Yeah.
For what being reading here, it says verse 15, and Sarah was afraid that she got caught lying, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So they knew that these people were not normal people.
They seem to have knowledge that the average person wouldn't have. They seem to know that she lied even though she wasn't standing outside. And it seems to be, not only do they know that she laughed, but almost the wording of what she said to herself. You know, she's inside the tent, they're out having food, she hears them say Sarah's going to have a kid, and she's sitting there chopping the onions going, oh yeah, right, I'm going to have a kid. With him so old? And somehow the people outside heard her.
But not the people, God.
But God. But the people. Because they're the ones who said that she was going to have the kid.
Right, but but God is the one who says Sarah's laughing.
Exactly. Isn't this fun? Sally?
There may be other times in the course of the Torah
Mm-hmm.
where God has spoken to someone, but not in his usual form.
Not in a form at all. In fact, what do we call people that God talks to in an all lucid sort of way?
Prophets.
Prophets.
So.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize there was a second part.
This is might be another example.
So perhaps these three guys are prophets.
And if only Moses is the only one who's ever allowed to see him in his natural form, then that would be an obvious thing that he made himself look like someone else.
So it could be that God is using a semblance of humanity, or it could be that these men are actually prophets, and therefore they are prophesying.
And that's why they would be with him at this time.
Right. No problem, right?
Okay.
Turn them into prophets rather than just your run-of-the-mill nomads.
Right.
Then they've got a reason to be there. They've got a reason to speak, the truth about the future. They can even speak with God's name, because we know that that's what prophets do. You know, when you read through Isaiah, when you read through Ezekiel or any of the other prophets, they say, God said, ... They're speaking with the assurance of God's understanding. So perhaps we've just got three prophets here.
You said vision before, you use the word vision.
Mm-hmm.
Are you saying this was a vision, or what would you mean by
I'm not saying anything yet.
No, you use the word vision.
What I was trying to interpret, what Kathy was saying, was that we could read this exchange as being a vision that Abraham is having that has no physical reality to it. That it is happening entirely within his mental, spiritual reality. That there are no people. Or maybe there are people, but they're not saying the things they seem to be saying. But instead, in his mind, he is seeing these things, or hearing these things.
You say he's hallucinating?
Well, hallucinating is a judgment call. When we say hallucinating, we mean it's false. But certainly the Bible understands the idea that people can have a mental or spiritual vision of something which doesn't have a physical reality to it. You know, when Ezekiel sees the vision of God's throne, there doesn't seem to be any indication that this was a physical thing, that this was something you could get out your tape measure, or that you could have, if you had a camera with you, that you could take a picture of it. That this was something that was coming straight into his mind from the Almighty. And the question would be, perhaps what's happening here is a direct projection from God into the mind of Abraham. And it may be happening at the same time as these people are here, or there may be no people at all. We could go down that road, and in fact, Rambam, Maimonides, actually does take that position, and says that whole first line that we had back on 18:1, Vayera elav Adonai, that God appeared to him. Everything that comes after is merely an explanation of God's appearance to Abraham in a spiritual, mental way. That everything that looks like it's physically happening didn't happen. That's Rambam's explanation. Okay, and I'm not asking you to buy that explanation yet, but that is one explanation, is the radical de-physicalizing of this whole scenario. And to say that...
And what was his clue to arrive at that opinion?
some of the clues that we've already discussed. Who is he bowing down to? Why is God all of a sudden talking to him rather than the people that were talking to him? And as we're going to see in just a few lines, when these guys leave, God is still there talking to him, and then they appear to Lot, and they seem to be angels there, and they're called angels. So it seems so confused, it's almost like a dream.
God also spoke to Sarah here.
Exactly. And so his idea is, this is just a mental projection of what Abraham is hearing from God. He's sitting under the trees, and this is what he sees. But anybody else with him who had their video recorder going would have just had blank tape of Abraham sitting under trees. Make sense? Not asking you to agree with it, but do you understand Rambam's position?
That's because you can't photograph it.
Because you can't photograph it. Apparently they show up well enough to eat. If we're going to call them angels, they look enough like reality to eat. So yeah, that's one position. That's the most radical literalizing, making it entirely into a dreamlike vision, rather than anything physical at all. Okay? Kathy was giving us sort of a halfway point. We're saying that there were really three guys there, and they were doing the whole hospitality thing, but all the God stuff, that was a vision. And it was something that Abraham was experiencing concurrently, along with having his guests. And then, of course, we can go to the idea. These are actually guys, and they're either just regular guys or they're prophets, which gives them a little bit more oomph and ability to predict, or maybe they're angels. Or maybe they really are God. Okay? Good. Nice and confused. That's the way I like it. All right, so as I explained, we end up on page 102, which is beginning with Genesis 18:16. We end up with the men leaving. Again, they're still being called Anashim. They're still being called men. And Abraham is left looking down at Sodom, which is where they're headed. And suddenly he finds himself again talking with God. And there don't seem to be any men anymore. The men have left. And now Abraham's talking to God about the coming destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah.
But God is musing with God's self.
Well, God muses with himself first and says,
Right.
well, I probably should tell Abraham about this. I don't want to keep it secret. So, Abraham, I got to tell you, something's coming. And begins the whole back and forth of, are you really going to destroy it? What if there are righteous people still in the city? Would you destroy the city even if there are a few righteous? Something to remind ourselves every time we think about the destruction that happened just along our coast, or Katrina, or anything else. Do we really think God would destroy the righteous along with the wicked? I mean, Abraham doesn't seem to think so, and God seems to agree that God would not destroy the righteous along with the wicked. But that's a whole other discussion to go into more detail. But we are left with this impression that Abraham is talking with God and that God was there the whole time. It seems that way. Does that make sense? All right? Which means if God was there the whole time, if these were three regular guys, what were they seeing? I mean, was it like they had a big table and, it was Abraham and three guys and God was sitting over here on the right? And then the guys got up and left and Abraham went and said, anyway, God, where were we before they showed up? Is that what happened? Well, indeed, there was a midrash that says that. That when you go all the way back to the very first line, actually, I don't need to explain this midrash. I can show you this midrash.
How come Abraham never says to God, but my nephew Lot lives in Sodom?
Well, we don't hear that as an argument. We hear only the argument about how many need to be saved. And if you do the math, Lot and his household are not enough.
Right.
So Abraham only gets down to 10, so maybe he felt at that point he didn't need to argue about total number, but that he thought God will save the few righteous people that are there, presumably referring to Lot, although we can see later from Lot's behavior that he's not exactly what you would call the most righteous of fellows. Certainly not the sharpest knife in the drawer.
He's righteous along the lines of Noah.
He's what?
He's righteous along the lines of Noah.
Well, I don't want to discourage Noah too much, but okay, I don't know whether we have enough copies. It looks like we didn't get quite as many made as I had hoped.
There should be some.
There are a few more coming around there. Ah, you already got one for yourself. Oh, you've been reading along the whole time. Here, these are the extras. Let me pass them down to this way. How many more do we need? I need one for myself to make sure that I can refer you to the right section. Maybe we can share a little bit if need be. Good. It's nice to have an abundance of students. Okay. So what we have here mostly at the beginning are different quotes from Bereshit Rabbah, from the great collection of Midrashim from the time of the sages, of the Chachamim, as they also try to unpack this rather complicated tale. So it starts off with a very straightforward idea, right? The Holy One, blessed be He, took the sun out of its sheath, meaning took the sun from behind its protective layer, so as not to trouble him with wayfarers. That is to say, God made the day really, really hot. That way no one would be out traveling. That make sense? Okay. That way Abraham wouldn't have to trouble himself. Right? Because we know that Abraham's the kind of guy that if he saw people traveling, he would be helping himself. But since, according to the juxtaposition of the two parshiot, Abraham had just been circumcised, God did not want him getting up and running around and helping people. Make sense? Mm-hmm. So God's being very considerate, making it really, really hot so no one's going to bother Abraham. But since he saw that he was troubled that no wayfarers were coming, he brought the angels to him in the likenesses of men. So God goes, well, I didn't want to bother him, but he looks really upset that there's no one coming, so I'll send some angels that look like people. That way he'll have a chance to do his hospitality thing, which gives him so much pleasure and satisfaction. Following that? Okay. Which, according to this midrash, what are the three men? Angels. Angels. Okay. This midrash says they must be angels. My lords, if only I had. This is that line back at the very beginning when he first bows down to the people, and it's going off the word Adonai, the actual word Adonai, not the pseudo stand-in. And it wants to understand what did he mean when he said Adonai in this sentence. Who would like to read that, to spare my voice from going on and on and on?
My lords,
thank you.
Only I have, etc. To the chief one he said this, and he called them all lords, and to the chief one he said, please do not pass by, because if he would not pass by, his companions would stay with him.
Keep going, just a little bit more.
According to this explanation, it, Adonai, does not refer to God.
All right, so that's first explanation. That the word Adonai is a plural word, and it's referring to the whole group because he's just being honorific. He's just being very respectful by using this term. However, it then has to deal with a second issue, which in the Hebrew is very noticeable and in the English is not, which is the rest of that verse, of verse 3. After the Adonai part, Abraham refers to the person he is talking to in the second person singular. You person, not you people, which in Hebrew is a very different verb construct. In English, when we say you, we can mean 10 people, we can mean 1 people. In Hebrew, you can hear the difference. And in this, he starts off saying Adonai, this plural, and then he says you. And the Midrash tries to resolve that by saying he refers to all of them, and then he talks to the chief of them. Because he knows if he can convince the chief to stop, the other two guys will follow along. So we still can be working under the assumption that this is angels or people, but we introduce the other layer of what did Abraham think they were. So we've been arguing so far what were they really. This introduces a second level, which is what did Abraham think they were? Did Abraham think they were angels? Did Abraham think they were people? Which can be a different answer than what the actual narrator wanted us to know about them. Does that make sense? Okay, but according to this first interpretation, the word Adonai is just a regular word, and it means that Abraham thought they were just regular people. And he was being nice. But
another explanation, it is holy. And he was telling the whole...
Meaning the word Adonai is actually a holy word and referring to something else.
And he was telling the Holy One, blessed be he, to wait for him until he would run and bring in the wayfarers.
So, we all got that? Abraham just put God on hold.
Let me take care of these people.
That when he said, Adonai, if I have found favor in your eyes, again, now we have the singular verb no problem, because he's talking to the one and only God. Then, just hold on a second, I've got to go help these people. We got that? That this sentence now, we don't need to worry about why he's bowing down. We don't need to worry about why he's using the word Adonai, because he's using it to talk to God, to put God on hold, while he takes care of the guests. Doesn't seem very logical? You mean you can't put God on hold?
We're in a congregation. Wait, let's see who's here.
But I'm just trying to figure out what's the logic. What's the
Why we're putting God on hold.
putting God on hold?
Wait,
But-
it's a
but-
little disrespectful to God.
A little disrespectful to God, maybe. Leave God hanging. On the other hand,
Well, the last time God was in.
Moses did it.
hold on. But on the other hand, if you are in the midst of your Amidah, which is for us in the modern world, the chance that we have to be among the closest feelings of being with God, and you see somebody get hit by a bus, do you stop your Amidah and go help them, or do you say, oh, I'm with God right now, I've got to finish my Amidah, and I'll get to them in a minute?
No.
No. You put God on hold, you stop your Amidah, and you run out and get the person, call 911, etc., etc., etc. Well, the welcoming of wayfarers, which was a very important mitzvah in the ancient world, not just from hospitality, but also for security reasons, that people traveling were often vulnerable, both to physical problems as well as possible banditry. Perhaps Abraham thought this was a worthy reason to put God on hold. Perhaps.
We have to remember that God doesn't have a clock.
And
Yeah.
also, God doesn't have a clock, so perhaps it was simply Abraham's polite leave-taking. But, I mean, is God going to get impatient? Is God going to get bored waiting for Abraham to finish with the guests? Is God going to say,
All the time in the
I was going to say, is God going to say, hey, you're wasting my time here? No. God doesn't mind being on hold because God isn't on hold. And Abraham may have simply not been putting God on hold, despite my more flippant terminology for it, simply be telling God, I have your other duties to attend to right now, which is taking care of these people. Our conversation will have to wait for a moment. Because this opportunity, this mitzvah is happening right now, and if I don't do something, they may go past, and I won't have a chance to serve them. Whereas you, well, you and I can always pick this up at a later time. Perhaps that was the intent. Or perhaps this midrash got it wrong entirely, and he wasn't talking to God, he was talking to the people.
So then that will prove that was not a projection in Abraham's mindset, but rather a reality.
This would argue for that. I don't know about the word prove, but it would certainly be on the side of the argument that would say he wasn't imagining the people. It doesn't necessarily make the people into angels yet, but it does mean that there would have been real people. Because after all, he couldn't put God on hold for a vision of other people, because then God would have been the one doing the visioning, and that's just, kind of freaky. But yes, it would absolutely argue that there were some real things there for him to see, that he would go and see. Yes. Okay? Good. On the other hand, we have an issue that's going to come later on, and looking at the clock, I don't think we're going to have a chance to look at the text itself. But if you keep reading into chapter 19, where the travelers, we'll call them that as a neutral term, reach the house of Lot. When they reach the house of Lot, they are referred to by the narrator as melachim, as angels. Okay?
And there's only two.
And there were only two of them. So when they reach Lot, they are being called by the narrator melachim, which might make us think, ha-ha! Identity resolved, they are actually angels. However, we never want to jump to a conclusion too quickly. Because first of all, we have to say, well, wait a minute, if they really are angels, why didn't they get called angels from the beginning? Why not just say melachim from, the first verse? Why wait until they get to Lot? And secondly, if they really are angels and are known as angels, why did Abraham treat them like people? And specifically, the Midrash gives us a little contrast here. The phrase, and bathe your feet. Anyone want to read that Midrash for us in a nice clear voice? Edie, you're looking eager.
He thought that they were Arabs who prostrate themselves to the dust of their feet, and he was strict not to allow any idolatry into his house.
All right, so the understanding from this Midrash, again, it's not every rabbi of the ancient world agreed, but this Midrash was, the reason Abraham washes their feet has nothing to do with hospitality and everything to do with getting rid of dirt that these people might worship. It's the equivalent of getting rid of a potential idol. Okay? But then that leaves us with the question, why, when it comes to Lot, Lot doesn't wash first, but instead invites them first. Abraham washes and then invites them. Lot invites them and then washes. And the contrast is explained.
But Lot, who was not strict, mentioned lodging before washing, as it is said, and lodge and bathe your feet.
Okay, so as we know, of course, Lot isn't so great. And unlike Abraham, who was very careful about possible idolatry, Lot, wasn't such a big deal. So he got the order wrong, is the interpretation of this Midrash. But for our purposes, the bigger question is, if they are called angels when they appear to Lot, why does Lot think to wash their feet at all? I mean, if the narrator calls them angels, then didn't Lot see them as angels? Well, that's an issue. An issue which, Edie, I'm going to go ahead and have you go ahead and read. Genesis Rabbah tries to resolve in one way.
But elsewhere, Scripture calls them men. When the Shekinah was with them, it calls them men. Another explanation, in connection with Abraham, whose power was great, and the angels were as frequently with him as men, it calls them men. But in connection with Lot, it calls them angels.
Okay, so the company you keep affects your ranking, is basically what this Midrash is trying to say. That when the Shekhinah, which is a word meaning God's presence, was traveling with them, which in this case is envisioning the Shekhinah plus two guys, that in that company, the angels didn't look like much of anything. Because, next to God, the angels might as well be men. And so it calls them men. However, the Shekhinah stays behind and talks with Abraham about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And now the two angels are able to be seen as angels in their own right, because they're not overshadowed by God's presence. So that's the first part of this interpretation. The other way to interpret it is by the human company they're keeping. Next to Abraham, angels are like men. I mean, the angels come and go at Abraham's house all the time. They're just like regular folk to him. And so it calls them men because that's how they are in Abraham's house. But when it comes to Lot, who was not exactly known for entertaining angels, especially given where his zip code was, there they stand out as angels. So it all depends on who you're lumping them with. And therefore they get called men sometimes or angels other. What this Midrash is saying, they're actually always the same.
I get that, but if they were angels in Lot's presence, why did Lot feel obligated into protecting them? Angels can take care of themselves.
Okay, so here we get to one of the biggest challenges to what Armando was upset about with this whole vision idea, which is, okay, in the scene with Abraham and Sarah and the cooking and all of that, I can do that as a vision, right? I can make that whole thing a dream, a vision, and it's fine, because it doesn't impact the rest of the world. But when you get down to Sodom and Gomorrah, I can kind of say Lot had a vision of the angels, but do I really have to buy that all the other people in the town had a vision of them too?
No.
I mean, who was attacking the town? I mean, who was attacking the door? Who did the blindness? What was going on there? Didn't something have to happen for the people to attack? Now, there is an answer to that, by the way, which is, of course, that it was all a vision too. And that was Lot's vision that was telling him it was time to go. And by the way, that would also explain why when Lot goes and talks to his married daughters, they treat him like a fool. Because after all, they were so far removed from any godliness that when he shows up and says, I can see it, the handwriting on the wall, to use another part of the Bible, that God is going to wipe this place out because I just had a vision of how bad the people in this town could be. And they're like, you're joking. And they literally call him a joker or a clown. And so he has to leave without them. So that could still be a vision, that the people didn't bang on the door, that there was nothing happening. Which would help with one other problem. Why is there a sense of tension and danger when the people come and knock on the door? If they're angels, right? When Lot says, oh, I'll protect them, here, have my daughters instead, the angels should have said, what are you afraid of? Keep your daughters in the house. If anyone tries to come through the door, man, we'll just blast them. We're angels. The actions of Lot make no sense if they are angels. Because there should be no tension. There should be no danger. It should be a perfectly safe place. Angels don't need to be afraid of people. And angels should be able to tell the people who are under their care, you don't need to be afraid of those people.
Well, it would seem like not until they rescue Lot from...
When they pull him back in from the
Right,
crowd.
does Lot get it? It would seem like he's just being hospitable. He thinks they're just people, just men, but...
But when they bring him back in and there's the
blind the
blindness
crowd,
of the crowd, then he goes, oh! Oh, I guess there's something special going on. And that works for Lot, but it doesn't work for the angels.
No.
Would they really have stood by and let Lot offer his daughters to the crowd if they had it within their capacity to blind the crowd from day one, from the first moment? Lot was perfectly willing to hand over his daughters. He wasn't happy about it, but he thought it was the lesser of two evils than handing over the two people that had come to his house. But the angels should not have been willing to let him hand over his daughters.
That's when they know there's not even 10.
That's when you have a very clear idea that there's not a full contingent of goodness in the town. But it does leave us with a question of, well, who were these people? Okay, we are coming up on our time, but I want to pass out one more page. And this is my attempt to summarize some of the issues involved and some of the problems with each of the different solutions to these issues.
A spreadsheet.
A spreadsheet, you can't do Torah without spreadsheet. All right, so what we have here are some of the events, and this is just a short version because we didn't go through everything. Some of the events that can pose a problem for any of the different interpretations that we have here. And we have to add in the basic idea of vision, as everything was a dream idea, which I know is not very satisfactory when it comes to a TV episode, where the main character wakes up at the end of the episode and goes, oh, it was just a dream. It didn't work in Dallas. It doesn't work in satisfactorily spiritually for other things either. But it is an option.
Elsewhere.
What's that?
It worked in St. Elsewhere.
And were you happy when they revealed that?
No.
No, you weren't.
It worked. But it did work.
It worked, but most of us are unsatisfied with that solution. But as we can see, there are some issues with each of the different possibilities. If it is God that is doing most of the acting throughout, then we've got a problem with the fact that he was already talking with God. How can God show up twice? Right?
Exactly.
If it's God there, then why does it seem to be a plural group? Right? We don't do the plural when it comes to God in Judaism. When we see people eating, God doesn't eat. Now, when we have the idea of knowledge, that they know that she's going to get pregnant and know what's going to happen, well, that works great if it's God. If there's this promise of returning later, when after the child is born, that's fine if it's God. After they go, God is still there. That's a little iffy, but we can kind of figure out, well, two of them left and one stayed, so that can sort of work. They are called angels when they get to Sodom. Well, obviously, if it's only God throughout, then why would they be called angels rather than God when happening in Sodom? There's danger in Sodom. God doesn't get afraid of anything. They are also called men, by the way, in Sodom as well, later on. which would be a problem if this was God. And the fact that they perform miracles in Sodom, well, that's okay, because God's, champion of miracles. Make sense? Okay. Angels, well, it solves some of the problems and causes other ones, right? God's already talking to Abraham. If angels are showing up, well, the Midrash kind of explains that they were sent at God's deliberate instruction, so we don't have to be too upset about them crossing roads. It's not elegant, but it's not a problem. The fact that it's plural, no problem for the angels. You can have as many angels as you want. The fact that they eat, we can sort of excuse that as that looked like they were eating rather than they were really eating. But it's not 100% satisfactory, but it works. The fact that they're going to know the future, no problem for angels. The fact that they say they're going to return, well, we have other midrashim saying that angels only get one job each. But still, that's another midrash. The fact that they're going to come back, that could be okay. The fact that after they go, God is still talking with him, that's no problem. The fact that they get called angels in Sodom, hey, that's perfect. The fact that there's danger and they get called men in Sodom, that's a little more awkward. And the fact that they're miracles, no problem if you're an angel. How we doing?
So what's the conclusion?
We're not done yet. Or we have the option, not just of men, because that's really cumbersome, unless you go for the whole vision route. But let's say that they're men, but they're actually prophets, meaning that they have some ability granted by their closeness with God that sets them a little bit apart from just your run-of-the-mill travelers. Then, already talking with God, and they show up, no problem, right? The people wander here and there, and the fact that he was talking with God ahead of time doesn't prevent that. Plural, no problem, they're real people. Eating, yep, they're flesh and blood, they got to eat. The fact that they know, well, that can kind of work, right? Because they're prophets, so they know that she's going to get pregnant. The fact that they say they'll return, well, again, we don't hear about them returning at the time of the birth, but it's not too much of a stretch. After they go, he's still talking with God, no problem again. The fact that they get called angels in Sodom and Gomorrah, well, that's a little bit more problematic, because now we're saying that they were prophets, flesh and blood men, but by the time they get down to Sodom and Gomorrah, they're being called angels. That can be a problem. Now, one possible solution is the fact that the word angel just means messenger, malachim. And perhaps they're simply being called malachim in a technical capacity rather than a spiritual capacity. The fact that there's danger in Sodom, that makes a lot of sense. They are flesh and blood, they can still be hurt. We know from many other parts of the Tanakh that prophets are absolutely able to be killed by bad people. Then later when they get called men in Sodom, it fits nicely as well. And miracles, well, prophets do occasionally do miracles. And specifically the miracle of blindness. If you look in the book of 2 Kings, we have an identical example where Elisha does a mass blindness miracle. So that can work. That can work. Okay, and the vision line we already talked over. So what do we think? What's the conclusion?
Well, just looking at the spreadsheet, you'd say vision wins, has the most okays.
But, well, vision has the fewest problems, I think would be the best way to summarize it. Vision takes care of most of the issues because we just say it's a dream.
Right.
However, vision is also possibly the spiritually less satisfying for most of us because we like the idea of things happening rather than it just being a vision. Your solution of saying there were things happening and it was the visionary interpretation of those things that lended the spiritual component is one way to solve that. But again, maybe we want something a little bit more tactile to be occurring. Second to that, probably the least problematic would then be to make them prophets and say these were guys. Now, that doesn't always jive with our feeling about the ancient world, where everyone else in the ancient world was evil except Abraham. But we do have the notion that there maybe were other prophets that were hanging around back then. Shem and Ebner are two of the possible candidates for who would have been prophets left over from after the flood.
There were actual cities of Sodom and Gomorrah
Yes.
that were obliterated.
Correct.
So, there's some fact, not total visionary happenings.
And Malka, as usual, you bring us right back to our beginning in a perfect way. We know what eventually happens.
Right.
How do we know how to interpret it? We know that the cities were destroyed. But do we interpret the destruction as something that we know explicitly happened because there was an angelic or divine visitation which explained it in an explicit way, or at least a godly appointed prophet who was explaining it in an explicit way? Or do we say, well, it was a vision, and we believe that Abraham and Sarah in other places is also called a prophetess, that they had accurate ways to interpret their visions, and therefore we can rely on it? Or do we say it's a vision, maybe they got it wrong? Maybe Sodom and Gomorrah got wiped out because it was just an earthquake, and it had nothing to do with their perceived or real immorality. Well, I personally don't think our tradition goes down the road of saying everything's open to interpretation. I think when it comes to the Torah explicitly and the rest of Tanakh, the interpretations given to deeds should be believed and followed. But it is a very good reminder for when we can or when we shouldn't interpret actions in our own day and age as somehow being divinely sanctioned or divinely created to teach us a lesson. And that's hard, because as unsatisfying as the whole vision thing might be for us to understand our ancestors, we can feel equally unsatisfied in our inability to be sure that we understand why things are happening or in the world around us today. And we want surety. We want certainty and clarity and the ability to say, this is what God is doing, and this is what God wants, and this is what God hates, and these different events show it clearly. We would love to be able to do that. I mean, wouldn't you like to be able to pick up the newspaper and read it, that the storm happened because God said? I mean, wouldn't that give a certain sense of meaning and of purpose and of structure and of organization to the world, rather than just saying the storm happened because the trade winds were enormous? That doesn't give me any security in my world. I can trust God. I can't trust random, Gulf streams. But sometimes that's all we've got.
Maybe the heading is, the storm happened because God said, wake up, global warming.
We can argue that, but then are we missing, if that was the reason that God, let's back this up. Make sure I get the right sentence without making any heretical statements.
You want to shut the camera?
What's that? I can always edit it out later if I happen to misspeak. We can interpret the events as a wake-up call. But when we say it was a wake-up call and only a wake-up call, and that was the entire intent of why God sent the storm, we may be missing the real intent if we got that wrong. Mm-hmm. And so as soon as we say, God did this so we would fight global warming, if God had another reason in mind,
right. Well,
we have just missed the boat.
Well, we never can say that sentence then, because we'll never know what's...
Well, we can say the sentence explicitly about the commandments. God has told us to do X. God has told us not to do Y. There's no way to, massage the interpretation of whether or not adultery is okay.
Right.
Adultery is categorically prohibited, and that's not open to interpretation or let alone reinterpretation. But to say so-and-so was in a car accident because God hates adultery, right, is a much, much more problematic statement, and one that we should avoid. So we can still defend the principles of God as we best understand them, but to try and ascribe a one-to-one correlation, a one-to-one understanding between act and God's will is problematic at best, as we see in this instance in the clear revelation with Torah and God's own chosen words. It's hard enough to figure out what's going on, and is quite likely blasphemous or heretical to do at the worst.
Then we have to learn that in every explanation we have to give room for what if.
We have to give room for what if, and we also have to realize that God is not going to write in giant neon letters across the sky, you're doing the right thing, you're doing the wrong thing. That is our job with Torah and with each other to make our best attempt. And God has been pretty clear in a lot of places. Yeah, there are some places where it's a little ambiguous and we gotta really try and tease out what God wants us to do and not to do. But for the vast bulk of our lives, day in, day out, God's made it pretty clear what we should be doing and what we shouldn't be doing. And if we think we need signs of cities being hit by storms or earthquakes or diseases to figure out what God wants, then we're missing what God has already told us explicitly through the gift of Torah.
There's only one problem I see with vision, and that is that it's subject to interpretation, which means my interpretation is just as good as yours.
And not only is that a problem with vision, but that's a problem with the other statements as well. Even when we have a non-visionary act, such as a hurricane hitting the coast, no one says that that's just a dream. We wish it were. The interpretation of that act, and let alone the interpretation of God's will behind the act, is always going to be open to interpretation. And so instead of trying to interpret God's act from signs, omens, and various acts that happen in the natural world, we interpret what God wants from the clearest thing he gave us, which is the Torah. And with that, say adieu, or I guess maybe shalom instead. I don't want to put too much French in here. And hope to see everyone on Shabbat. Take care.